Hey, everybody, this is Harvey Sluggo Wasserman back for the 144th Green Grassroots Emergency Election Protection Coalition Zoom call. We're starting off with 53 people and the great MEDEA Benjamin, along with DENYS BONDAR. Our first hour today, we are going to focus on Ukraine and on the reactors at Zaporizhzhia and the request to get the United Nations in there to take them over, for God's sakes. Not since the Suez crisis in 1956 has the UN sent in a protective force, but in this case, we really need it, obviously. So the first hour is going to be taken up with Ukraine. We're going to hear from Carl Grossman as well as Tatanka Bricka on both the political situation in Ukraine and on the nuclear crisis. In the second hour, we'll be joined by Josh Fox, the great activist filmmaker. And we're also going to deal with some gerrymandering issues. Actually, a couple of court decisions in New York and Alabama, of all places, that have gone in our favor in terms of democracy and putting an end to gerrymandering. That will be in the second hour. But we're going to start with the great MEDEA Benjamin, one of the true vanguard activists. If ever my daughter has had a role model, it would be MEDEA Benjamin. She is just ferocious and nonstop. Has a book out now about Ukraine. We'll hear her speak on Ukraine, and then joined by DENYS BONDAR to tell us about the horrific and terrifying situation with the nuclear reactors in Ukraine. And then we're going to open it up. We'll do the full hour. After all, this is a war, and probably in the history of the world, it is as dangerous a war as we've ever had because of the presence of these 6 nuclear plants. I also read somewhere someone is claiming that there was a breach in the security at the storage facility for Russia's nuclear weapons. So we will talk about all that, but we want to start with MEDEA. MEDEA, you're welcome to post in the chat the link to your book. Tell us about your book and tell us what you want to say from Code Pink and from your great history as a peace activist, what your feelings are and your take is on the war in Ukraine.
Well,
Somebody needs to mute. Go ahead, MEDEA.
Thank you for inviting me on, and I know people are in this call, as well as around the world, are so concerned about the climate issue as we are dealing with the record heat. People are starting to understand how this is an existential threat to the planet. The same is true of Ukraine, and unfortunately, there's not enough people who understand that existential threat when you have what has become very much a proxy war between the US and Russia that have 95% of the world's nuclear weapons. People should be really up in arms about this continued war and be doing everything they can to figure out ways to get all the parties to the negotiating table. I just got back from Ukraine. I wrote this book about a year ago. It's called War in Ukraine, Making Sense of a Senseless Conflict. And while I'm talking, maybe somebody could put the link in. But I went to Ukraine recently just to try to get a sense, a year and a half into this war, what people there were thinking. And unfortunately, I found most of the people I talked to thinking that a victory was possible in terms of Ukraine getting back every inch that Russia had taken of the Donbass and Crimea. And my sense from both everything that I read on what's happening on the ground, as well as what has clearly become lack of progress in Ukraine's counteroffensive, as well as documents that were leaked from the Pentagon a few months back, show that this is really a stalemate, that all that's happening now is a lot of soldiers getting killed, a lot of civilians being killed, a lot of continued death and misery. And so when I talk to people in Ukraine about how they think this war is going to end. On the one hand, they are fed a steady diet in the Ukrainian media and from their leaders that they are going to be able to take back 100% and achieve a real victory. When I said that, I would respond and say, do you think Russia is really going to allow Ukraine to take back Crimea? Privately, people would say no, but we can't talk about that publicly. And so there you have on one side the idea that a victory is possible. And of course, you have that on the Russian side as well, that they believe they are much more capable militarily than the Ukrainians, no matter what weapons NATO puts into the mix. And they have, of course, the ultimate weapon, which is a tactical nuclear weapon, which they have actually threatened to use. So my great misgiving is not only all the weapons that NATO is throwing into this, and we can talk about the latest horrific decision on the part of the Biden administration to send in cluster munitions, despite a global ban that 123 nations have signed, despite the fact that depleted uranium is being sent in with armor that the British are sending in, that not just all of these weapons that NATO is putting into this mix, but that the United States, particularly the Biden administration, has not done anything to push for negotiations, has not done anything to talk directly to Putin or to Lavrov, and has not done anything to push Zelensky towards negotiations. Now, you might say, well, it's the Russians that really need to be pushed. And of course they do. And I think that's why many of us were excited about the Chinese coming in with their peace proposal, because they do have so much leverage with the Russians. But so far, the US and NATO have done nothing to push for negotiations, have continued this myth that Ukrainians can have complete victory. And it's just taking us deeper and deeper into a war that could easily turn into a third world war and could easily turn into a nuclear conflagration. So I think it's our job to join with coalitions like the Peace in Ukraine Coalition, like the International Group of Progressive Democrats of America, like the organization I represent, which is Code Pink, and find ways that we can be educating and mobilizing more people. I do want to say at a positive note that while it's been very difficult to bust through the mainstream media narrative and the narrative we get from the vast majority of people in Congress, as well as from the White House, that is changing. It's changing as the war drags on and public opinion shows that more and more Americans want to see a negotiated settlement. It's changing as there are more Republicans, not just those on the extreme right, who are putting forward initiatives to stop the flow of weapons and instead support negotiations. And it's opening up because there are presidential candidates from the Republican Party, the Democratic Party, people running like Cornel West for the Green Party, and very soon probably more libertarians running for president, who are taking a position that we have to find a way to end this war at the negotiating table. And this is a very popular position. It's reaching millions of Americans, and I think it's giving us the space that we need to do more organizing. So that's the basics that I wanted to put out, and I'm open for whatever discussion you'd like to have.
MEDEA, it's really great to hear from you. You're so articulate and powerful. I wanted to make sure that this is a two-pronged discussion, if you don't mind. I want to, before we have response to your particular talk, I wanted to add in DENYS BONDAR. Last week, we began discussing with Howie Hawkins, who's on the call from the Green Party, the movement to get the United Nations to send a peacekeeping force to the Zaporizhzhia nuclear plant. So, DENYS, if you will follow MEDEA, and then we'll go to Carl Grossman and Tatanka Bricka and have a general discussion. Thank you for that, MEDEA. If you can post in the chat, or Steve, if you can post in the chat the link and the title for MEDEA's book, that would be great. DENYS BONDAR, you're talking to us from New Orleans, and you've been working to get the UN to send a peacekeeping force into Zaporizhzhia. Can you tell us about your efforts, please?
Thank you, Howie, for this invitation. So I would like to maybe begin a little bit by saying, kind of as a response to MEDEA's comments, that this war, I'm originally myself from Ukraine, and my parents and friends still live there. And this war actually a lot reminds me of what my grandparents told me about the World War II. There's a lot of similarity. And in fact, this war is the absolutely existential war for Ukrainian people. And I would like to bring to your attention this publication that was put forth by Russian political scientists or political technologists, rather, at the beginning of the full-scale invasion of Ukraine.
Okay, but DENYS, let's focus for the time being on the nuclear aspect, and then we'll get into the politics of the war, if we would.
Okay, sure. Let's do that.
Please, go ahead and tell us what's going on at Zaporizhzhia.
Yeah. So I have to say, first of all, I would like to right away spotlight this beautiful and very informative article posted on the blog of Union of Concerned Scientists by Ed Liman on July 7 about the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant. And in particular, Liman criticizes here the international agencies for actually downplaying the risk of the current situation in the plant. So the risks are actually very high. There's plenty of scenarios from mild to absolutely catastrophic. And Chernobyl-like scenario or Fukushima-like scenario are not yet ruled out, cannot be ruled out. And this has to be important. Moreover, Ed Liman actually draws our attention to the fact that currently the power plant is operating in the regime where no power plant on Earth has been nuclear power plant was actually in operation, meaning that all 6 reactors are in long-term cold or hot shutdown with fuel still inside the reactors. This has never been done before. So in fact, this is a very dangerous. Literally, this reactor is operating in the regime where nobody knows what's going to happen. And the scenario for Fukushima and Chernobyl-like disaster still cannot be ruled out. So this is very important to realize. Earlier in October, myself was with Zakhar Popovich and MV Ramana. We have actually reached out to the trade union of Ukrainian nuclear workers, whose members are still at the plant, and actually engineers that run the plant. And we actually conducted an interview. So as I said, it's a little bit out of date, October 7. And a very stark picture about the conditions of nuclear workers emerged. That the people are, it's horrible conditions. They're under constant harassment by FSB and other Russian security. There is people feel unsafe. The nuclear power plant. There's an Energodar city, where the nuclear power plant workers live. The living conditions are disastrous. The humanitarian aid cannot be reached because Russians are actively blocking it. All this very difficult situation. It's very important to realize that these workers operate a very highly, of course, dangerous facility, and the fact that they are living in such a distressed situation is not a welcome development. In fact, according to International Atomic Agency, the main factor to tackle any possible accident is actually the staff has to be on place and in a good state of mind. So this is, the living conditions cannot be factorized out from the discussion about the plant. It's an integral part. And unfortunately, I reached out to them again recently, and the situation did not improve. It got even worse. Actually, it got even worse. The Russian management is Russian occupation forces trying to impose, trying to force the upper management of the plant actually to sign the contract with Rosatom. It's a Russian nuclear agency. Whereas the majority of the engineers still actually refuse to sign the contract with Rosatom. And this harassment still continues, and the situation, the living conditions are still very, very bad. Unfortunately, I have to say that the nuclear plant workers, engineers, they feel betrayed by the international community. They feel that the role of International Atomic Agency has been actually rather negative, actually, not a constructive. It's basically de facto serves to legitimize the presence of the Russian forces, and the only solution actually to the security of this facility is to Russian forces to actually withdraw. That's the only solution. And in fact, the trade union Atomprofspilka, that's the name of the trade union. They feel, you can hear the pain, how they feel abandoned by the international community. Now,
I mean, the international community.
So, international agencies, yes.
Yeah, the International Atomic Energy Agency, unfortunately, also promotes nuclear power.
Yes.
And you are right. We have been seeing spokespeople from the nuclear industry downplaying the danger here. Let me very quickly, if I can, we have the 6 reactors there. This is the biggest nuclear plant in Europe because it has 6 reactors. Every one of them is capable of a Chernobyl or a Fukushima. They are in various states of shutdown. Correct me if I'm wrong, Dennis. They're in various states of shutdown, from cold to, I guess, hot. But all the 6 fuel pools are vulnerable because they need constant cooling, and the fuel supplies are dubious, and it's an extremely unstable situation. And God forbid, should the fuel pools lose cooling, we would have the idea that the reactors being in shutdown becomes irrelevant because of the gargantuan quantities of radiation that would come out of the fuel pools. Is that correct, Dennis?
I mean, it's true. There are plenty of scenarios. Yes, 5 reactors are in cold shutdown and 1 in hot shutdown to produce steam, which is necessary for plant maintenance. Yes, of course, the AE and the other agencies, they actually say, oh, the design of the reactors are not Chernobyl-like, so therefore the Chernobyl-like accident cannot happen. But this is just not, Fukushima was not Chernobyl-like design, but still, the amount of radiation released at Fukushima disaster was comparable to Chernobyl's. Of course, the vast majority of it went into the ocean. That's the difference.
Right. It came to California too. Now, you said that you feel the only solution is a Russian withdrawal, but wouldn't the arrival of security forces from the United Nations mitigate the situation?
Yeah, so let me continue. So as here I show on the screen the report from International Labour Organization corroborating the conversation that I have had with the union members on the state of very horrible state affairs for workers there. So now, I would like to draw your attention to this interesting fact that the head of the Department of Nuclear Energy at International Atomic Agency is actually former Rosatom senior manager. I mean, this is his name is Mikhail Chudakov, and this is the snapshot from the webpage. I mean, is it not clear evidence of some kind of conflict of interest, to put it very mildly? I mean, this is unacceptable, right? And Rosatom is trying to claim the ownership of this plant and operational ownership. So this explains the dysfunction of EAE, right? Handling this crisis, very serious crisis.
Okay, very good. MEDEA, did you want to? Dennis, thank you so much for that.
Just to my slides, that Taras Belus, an activist from Ukraine, quite an affinist left activist, make a proposal, and I would like you to read his article and comments about his proposals, how UN can play a very prominent role. And based on that, Ukrainian Socialist Solidarity Network made a meeting where I was a part of it and Taras was part of it. and we had drafted a petition to actually we're calling for actually creating a demilitarized zone around the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant, and we would like to follow the model of the Suez Channel crisis, where actually Britain invaded Egypt, and in order to circumvent the General Security Council, the Security Council, the General UN Assembly voted to introduce peacekeeping force in the Suez Channel, and it was approved, and it was sent there. So we would like to we proposed petition exactly following this pattern. This is right now absolutely working solution. I think this is a immediate measure which can be effective to create a DMZ zone, DMZ around the plan, following the well-established international precedent. We have translated this petition to many languages, as you can see. Here. Please, distribute. Please consider signing it. We are, we need your support right now, and if this is successful, this will be great, because this again will show that international agencies like UN can still be force for good, can still help a lot, to solve the crisis. Thank you.
Thank you. Very, very good. MEDEA, do you want to comment on what DENYS has said here?
Well, I think it's a great idea. I'd be totally supportive of a demilitarized zone. And I know that there are a number of international groups that have actually gone there and tried to do a people's version of this. But, this is much more than individuals can take on. We certainly need the United Nations.
Absolutely. I'm going to call on Carl Grossman in a minute, a great nuclear expert, but I want to give people very quickly the potential scope of a disaster at the Zaporizhzhia nuclear plant is pretty much incomprehensible. I mean, we're talking about 6 very large reactors. There's far more radiation involved in Zaporizhzhia than there was at Chernobyl. Chernobyl was a relatively new reactor. These reactors have been operating for a while, and the fuel pools are loaded. The amount of radiation that could come out of a disaster at Zaporizhzhia would dwarf Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and certainly approach Chernobyl and Fukushima, probably by multiple factors. So MEDEA, it's great to hear you. I hope you've got time to stick with us. And before we go into the politics of the war, I want to deal with this with a couple of experts. Nobody knows more about nukes than Carl Grossman, and then Howie, if he can mention Howie Hawkins, and then Tatanka Bricka, so we can mention the actual mechanics of this petition. DENYS, I noticed there are only 600 signatures on that petition. Is that the only one that's going around? DENYS, are there more petitions?
There were few competing petitions, earlier petitions, with slightly different flavor, but yes, that's yeah. Okay. I mean, it's growing. We posted I think a little bit more than a week ago, or a week ago. So hopefully, everybody could spread the word, and this will get together. And again, this is the UN can still do a lot. We would like to emphasize, despite all the negative sort of things that we see, but it still can do this. It still can save.
I don't know who else could. I mean, MEDEA, I know that you've been desperately working for peace for quite a while in Ukraine. Has the UN been any help at all in bringing peace to Ukraine?
Well, the UN has been involved in the grain deal, which unfortunately Russia just pulled out of. And the Secretary General has been verbally very supportive, but I think there's a lot more that they could do. And people, we have friends who are staff in the UN, and they have been getting staff members of the UN by the hundreds to be pushing that the UN get more involved. So yeah, they certainly could do more, and this is one example.
What has been the holdup? I mean, you would think that the UN would have been involved a long time ago. What's keeping the UN from getting involved there, MEDEA?
Well, as I said, it's not that they're not involved. It's more what can they do that's outside. I mean, let's face it, they get most of their funding comes from the US. They have a Security Council that's dysfunctional because of the veto power of the Big Five. And so it's hard to get anything done when they have been mostly doing things like having General Assembly sessions where different measures have come up, but those are really just symbolic. Many of them are to condemn Russia, but then even the countries that vote to condemn Russia have turned around and said, well, we don't want to comply with the sanctions, and we really don't want to get involved in a war between the US and Russia as they see it. So the UN has so many bureaucratic and just internal obstacles to getting things done.
Well, we admire your continued efforts. Carl Grossman, do you want to comment on the nuclear situation? Howie on the petition to the UN, and to talk, and then we'll go to Win Fireman and Wendy Lederman. Go ahead, Carl.
Yeah, what I would suggest people read is the work of Bennett Ramberg, and on the chat I put in the a connection to a most recent article. It's from last year. It was on Project Syndicate. He wrote the book. This is 1985, Nuclear Power Plants as Weapons for the Enemy. And through the years, and I'm talking now about more than, like 3 decades, I've quoted from his book and I've quoted from his writings. I think this is very important because a nuclear power plant is and this has been said by others, a pre-deployed weapon of mass destruction. And as Bennett writes in this most recent piece on Project Syndicated, there is no international convention that bans attacks on nuclear plants in wartime. The International Atomic Energy Agency has made little headway, and I don't know how much of a push it's given, in persuading the Conference on Disarmament. This is part of the UN. It's out of Geneva, to adopt a new protocol, because the only protocol that exists is the only global accord that even purports to address the matter, and Bennett cites it. And let me just go on for a few minutes. In this article, and again, I provided the link, Bennett traces the first attack at a nuclear power plant to 1980, when Iran went after the Osirak nuclear plant in Iraq. Didn't cause great damage. 9 months later, Israel got involved and did destroy that plant. He goes on about how during the 1991 Persian Gulf War, both Iraq and the United States targeted active nuclear sites. And then I'm reading from the piece, and I'll just be brief here. That brings us back to Russia's war in Ukraine, which involves a threat to nuclear reactors unlike anything we've ever seen before. He speaks about Russia locating missiles and artillery in Zaporizhzhia, has turned the installation into a military base from which it has launched munitions. And he talks about the fallout risk. And then this is really important because it's not just Ukraine where you could have nuclear power plants involved in war. Here, Bennett talks about East Asia and China rumblings about taking Taiwan for force, putting a spotlight on the island's 2 active nuclear power plants. Moreover, China has numerous reactors on its southern coast that could become Taiwanese military targets. North Korea has, it goes on and on and on. India and Pakistan. There really has to, just let me get to the end of Ramberg's piece here, which again, I really suggest folks read this. Now that the war in Ukraine has laid bare the risk we face, the international community has no excuse besides getting action on this issue. The world needs a formal convention that bans attacks on nuclear reactors and related facilities. I mean, this is also a very big reason why there shouldn't be nuclear power, period. And in my view, every nuclear power plant in the world, all 400 plus, should be shut down for all the hazard, all the threat they pose to life. But certainly, this is a very specific issue. It's getting hotter and hotter as the decades have gone by, and it should be on the agenda of every peace group, peace organization, and every safe energy anti-nuclear organization. Again, the name of Ramberg's book, and get it, it's 1985, published by the University of California Press, but all the points in the book are still, if not even more so, critical today. Nuclear power plants as weapons for the enemy.
Okay, thank you. And we also have to remember, of course, that when the people who took down the World Trade Center were planning their attack, at least according to the reports we have, they did contemplate hitting the Indian Point reactors just north of New York City. Howie Hawkins, you want to comment quickly on the attempt to get the UN involved, and then we'll go back to MEDEA and DENYS, and then we'll go to Tatanka.
Yeah, I'm going to post in the chat again that article that Dennis referred to by Taras Billis, which really goes into why this is politically feasible. There are about 35 countries that abstained from condemning Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine. And they did so for economic and geopolitical reasons. But this resolution would not be directly crossing Russia. It would be about protecting all of us all around the world. So politically, we could get a lot more countries. It would be a much stronger resolution. And then Russia might feel politically compelled to say, okay, we're withdrawing our military forces and the UN peacekeepers will take over. That's the political strategy there. And urge people to, read Taras's article and then get involved in spreading this. I mean, MEDEA, if you can get Code Pink and Peace in Ukraine Coalition behind this petition, that will help a lot. It's a really serious situation. I mean, I don't think it's been mentioned that Ukrainian intelligence believes the cooling pond has been mined and that there may be mines on top of two of the reactors. And then they pulled out the top management from Rosatom away from the reactor as of July 5th, which may indicate something may be up. So we can't wait. This is a real serious situation. So again, I urge everybody to sign that petition and spread it around. And I think this is something that's politically feasible in the UN. I mean, I think MEDEA was right. They pass resolutions and they don't do anything. But we got to put pressure on, at least the United States to push this in the UN General Assembly.
MEDEA, do you want to comment on that?
No, as I said, I think it's a positive thing, and I look forward to reading more about it.
Okay. DENYS, did you want to make a mention? Then we'll go to Tatanka, Lynn Feinerman, and Wendy Lederman.
Yeah, so thank you for this, for the positive feedback for the petition. And indeed, the news from, I didn't want to cite the most recent news about how we did, it's kind of scary, to be honest. There's scary reports coming out. So indeed, the situation is rather much more urgent than I was trying to depict, but the whole, and it's politically absolutely feasible. That's Taras Bilus's article, I think, makes a strong case for this. And in fact, it's actually absolutely, Zelensky was pushing for this earlier this year. But unfortunately now sort of more of a panic kind of reporting is coming from Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant. But this is I think everybody in the world would welcome this.
Well, as someone who has interviewed people downwind from 3 Mile Island in 1980, and then been to Kyiv for the conference, the 10th anniversary of Chernobyl, and who marched against Fukushima, I am absolutely terrified. I would have to say, in my world, as a historian, that this is probably the most dangerous situation the world has faced since the Cuban Missile Crisis. And there is nothing that could compare in terms of destruction of human health and safety or the natural environment to the worst case scenario, or even not even the worst case scenario at Zaporizhzhia. Thank you for that, Dennis. Thank you, Medea. Tatanka Bricka, and then Lynn Feinerman and Wendy Wiederman. Tatanka, go ahead.
Yeah, I think I'll just share a personal story to underlie what Medea has been talking about for ever since this started, is that this is a proxy war between the major powers. It's largely been framed between Ukraine and Russia, but we are very much involved. This story will talk about the plans behind the plans, so amount of humility, people who are citizens of the United States, and you can have no truth and reconciliation without truth. So 1976, I completed a campaign I worked for my friend David Harris, who just recently passed, who ran for Congress in the peninsula. The campaign ended the first week of November, and I got a call in the third week of November, 1976, which is almost 50 years ago, from a couple that was an ideal campaign couple. They put 32 people in the seats. They each had checkbooks. They made calls. They walked precincts, etc. They called me into their office. They happened to be working at Stanford Research Institute, which became Stanford Research International, when Stanford students protested the CIA's involvement there and the Defense Department with, around Silicon Valley and David Packard, etc. So I found out that was their place of work. I came in and they said, we would like to offer you a job. We think you'd be ideal for this. And I said, what does it pay and what will I do? And when will it start? And it was a nearly $200,000 a year job in 76 for somebody who's a community organizer and out of work. It's highly attractive. I said, what will you do? What would I do? I said, well, it involves travel. It involves per diem and have a seat. So I had a seat. And they said, okay, we'll be frank with you. 15 years from now, there will be no Soviet Union. And it's the first time I'd heard that in 1976. I said, what do you do? He said, well, we're working in the Soviet republics to bring democracy. And I said, and they said, well, yeah, there's a lot of resources there that we can connect with our corporations, et cetera. What is it you want me to do? Well, we need help on our Ukraine team, and we think you would be ideal, and within a year, you could run the whole operation. Well, okay, I also know you have a 50-year plan. I knew by now I wasn't going to take the job, but I wanted to get some information. And I said, I know you have a 50-year plan. What is that? And they went through decade by decade. They took me into the room. They showed me Ukraine, strategic importance, the history, the breadbasket of the world, et cetera. And they said, shortly after the year 2020, the US will very likely be at war with Russia, whoever the president is. And there will be a need for Russia to be involved in and they went like this, print the quotes, our defensive arrangement of NATO. And the whole thing was because we needed to have Russia, after it had gotten rid of its ethnic provinces, to join the rest of the Caucasian nations of Europe to isolate China. That was our real enemy. Now, this is nearly 50 years ago. So, yes, there's no excuse for anybody invading Ukraine, but Putin is easily to make the bad guy. There's a larger thing at work here. So we have to be first understand that this is a proxy war, and these things take their long time plan, and that truth and reconciliation is needed. And I'm so happy to hear everybody speaking. I will read these books. I will sign this petition and try to get the word out, because it is a tragedy for everybody involved in war all the time, but it is a major global tragedy potentially for all life on Earth. So,
yeah, and thank you for
hesitate.
that, Tatanka. And as we, let's move ahead. Lynn, thank you very much, Tatanka. Did you want to comment, Medea or Dennis, before we move ahead? No? Okay. Lynn, go ahead, Dennis, very quickly.
With all due respect, this is not a proxy war in any sense. in any reasonable sense. So first of all, if it were a proxy, I mean, so first of all, right, the Ukraine has so why in principle the military aid to Ukraine from the United States is actually not only morally justified but also actually legally can be justified, is due to the document which is called the Budapest Memorandum, which was signed in 1994 with the United States, UK, Russia, and Ukraine, where Ukraine, as a possessor of the third largest nuclear arsenal at that time, give up all its nuclear weapons in this in exchange for the assurance, for the security assurance from once again Russian Federation, UK, US. And unfortunately, this document is not actually, only some Republicans mentioned this occasionally, but this is a big deal. Plus, Ukraine also signed the Treaty on the Conventional Forces. Is a co-signatory on conventional forces in Europe, where actually lots of weapons were actually transferred to Russia from Ukraine, like several thousand tanks, like hundreds of armed personal carrying vehicles, etc., many missiles. So it's and we see that there's not even weapons in NATO, right, to actually defend, to support large scale invasion. And if it were in proxy war, why would Russian TV claim that we want to do a genocide in Ukraine, right? Openly calling for killing 2,000 Ukrainians. So it's a more complicated than that. It's not a proxy war. It's a United States is doing its obligations according to the Budapest Memorandum.
Okay, well, we're getting into the partisan weeds here, but we do have 15 more minutes, and this is expected. Lynn, and then Wendy, go ahead, and then Fireman.
Okay. First of all, I would like to say I entirely support Carl Grossman's proposal for protection and shutting down of all the nuclear power plants, and whatever contractual or treaty situation we can put up there, I'm for it. Second of all, I think that a lot of the conversation is about, again, Russia's war in Ukraine or Ukraine's war with Russia. I think we need to take Tatanka's experience and instruction very seriously. This is a proxy war. The United States has 800 plus military bases around the world. It wants to control the world, and it is conducting proxy wars on all levels. I think that it's very difficult for someone like MEDEA, who wants to bring people together, to even broach a subject like this. And certainly she can't get on radio or TV a lot doing it. So she's taken the wisest and most subtle approach to actually just trying to get a treaty or at least a ceasefire of some kind. But somehow, someday, we are going to have to face the fact that the United States has an aggressively controlling and destructive foreign policy, and that involves proxy wars, what we call proxy wars, with all due respect to DENYS and his viewpoint. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Wendy Learman.
Thank you. And thanks so much, especially for MEDEA, for being with us and all the amazing work you've done through the years. I hope everyone here has followed her prolific work just to bring peace to the world, which just seems almost like a dirty word after being at war for 20 years constantly. From what I understand, there was actually some sort of peace agreement that was come to with Zelensky and Putin back in March of 2022. And days later, Boris Johnson went to take a visit to Ukraine, and then they pulled out of it and NATO stepped in. And, we can talk about the...
and Bucha happened, right? The massacre, right? When
okay,
was liberated and corpses were discovered, right?
Thank you. So there were peace agreements made because, right now the globe is facing climate catastrophe. I'm in South Florida now, and we're roasting. There's so many things enemies we face as a global species, and for the entire world to be teetering on the border of world war for this one thing, when there's so many other factors happening in Africa and everywhere, it doesn't make sense to me. And the trillions of dollars basically we're sending over there now while people are starving in our streets doesn't need to happen. So I know MEDEA brought up NATO for a moment before. I don't know if she wants to comment a little bit on that and just how close we could be to World War III and what we as a people can do to pressure our representatives to start negotiations and become a leader in peace and diplomacy again, because we are on a suicidal track and we cannot continue. It is not sustainable for us or our planet. Thank you so much.
Thank you. And MEDEA mentioned there's three types of weapons we're sending there. Cluster munitions, which we talked about last week, are a real nightmare. The DU, the depleted uranium, it makes it into a nuclear war on the low level, but it's still a nuclear war. And then the treaty on the mines that we have refused to sign. Wendy, I'm sorry, MEDEA, Wendy mentioned you. Do you want to say something in response?
I think it's important to bring up this issue of NATO because next year NATO is going to be hosted in the US in Washington, D.C. Its summit will be July 9th through 11th. We have no idea where things will be in the war in Ukraine, but we have to know that NATO is not a defensive alliance. It's a warfare alliance. It's an aggressive military alliance. At their meeting in Vilnius, they invited those countries in the Asia Pacific that are key to the US, and that is New Zealand, Australia, South Korea, and Japan, to strengthen that partnership to confront China. So NATO is already setting its sights on China. Anybody who cares about peace in the world, who doesn't want to see nuclear confrontation, should see NATO as an alliance that must be dissolved. And so we're already starting to look at how we can organize for next year to bring people in the United States who care about the environment, people who care about poverty, race issues, whatever it is. If you want to see the $1 trillion that the US is spending on militarization instead spent on dealing with the climate crisis and global poverty and pandemics, then we really ought to unite no matter our differences and focus on how are we going to move towards the dissolution of NATO.
I just want to interrupt here. Thank you for that, MEDEA. Thank you very much. I hope, by the way, you'll put the contacts for Code Pink in the chat. This has been, for those of you listening to us on the Solartopia Green Power and Wellness show on Progressive Radio Network, we're nearing the end of our first hour. We've been talking with MEDEA Benjamin of Code Pink and DENYS BONDAR from Ukraine on the war in Ukraine and the horrific dangers we face at the Zaporizhzhia nuclear plant, and the request, the movement to get the United Nations to make a security, a demilitarized zone around the Zaporizhzhia plant. This dialogue will continue in the second hour, but you won't hear it at PRN. If you want to swing over and hear the rest of it, we're at electionprotection2024.org, electionprotection2024.org. Thank you, Dylan, Rodney, for engineering us at Progressive Radio Network, and glad to have you with us for another week. And as I say, we will continue. Go to electionprotection2024.org. Justin, and then Dorothy Reich. Go ahead, Justin.
Sure. I've heard some folks mention economic leverage and climate change. I'd like to see the United States put its money where its mouth is and do the same kind of thing it did with China regarding the 5G and spying, in which Biden actually they called it decapitated the silicon industry in China by saying that anybody who consulted with or worked with the Chinese on chip technology going even as far back as the 90s, that technology that old, would lose their citizenship protections and even international military protections by doing so. And so a comparable thing for Russia would be anybody who works in their oil industry and their oil fields loses their international protections as well. so that there actually is some economic leverage, because Russia is still largely not only an oil economy, they're largely a contractor economy, that if they don't get help from the outside, they can't even prop themselves up.
Okay, thank you for that, Justin. Very interesting. We appreciate it. William Bronson, you're raising your hand, and then we'll go to Dorothy and Howie. William, did you want to say something before I go to Dorothy? Go ahead, William.
I just wanted to urge Dennis to contact the Physicians for Social Responsibility, which is a crucial physicians organization that played a very key part in the struggle in the 60s and 70s. And I sent him the phone number and name of the Sacramento leader of PSR in order to get to the national. I don't know where the national is any longer. PSR has been rather silent, but I think it would be a very important crowd to mobilize for the petition. That's all I had to suggest.
Thank you. I received. Thank you very much.
Yes, thank you. And a PSR would be a great group to circulate this petition. If nothing else comes out of this call that's tangible, aside from people getting MEDEA's book, I would hope that we can push this petition, because God help us all. Dorothy Reich, go ahead, Dorothy, and then Howie. Dorothy Reich, you need to unmute. Did you just disappear? There you are. Okay, go ahead.
You know, years ago, there was an article in The Intercept, and I can never find it, but it described a meeting between the Wall Street analysts and the defense industry, where the defense industry said to the Wall Street analysts, "Do not fear, because when the war in the Middle East is over, there's always the Far East." And today there's another article, and the article says that, well, the defense industry now is really just pushing for a Cold War with China to build up their military, production, and they're not looking now for a hot war with China, because I think they've realized that that's too destructive. I mean, they like their iPhones, they don't want a hot war with China. But I think this war in Ukraine is kind of keeping them going. They want to keep it going. There's a lot of money to be made, and they don't see any upside for them to end this war. It's like what Lyndon Johnson said: I can't stop the war in Vietnam. My friends are making too much money. I mean, the defense, the lobbyists for the defense industry are just across the street from the White House. There would be articles about it when Biden first got elected. So,
well, no matter what, Dorothy, you're right. I mean, no matter which side you're on, the military industry is profiting from this war. And, the thing about the Zaporizhzhia issue and global warming, as MEDEA says, and other climate issues, it doesn't matter which side you're on. And whether you think it's a proxy war or not, Zaporizhzhia is not going to discriminate if those radioactive clouds go out of those reactors.
Well, I was just laughing with my friend. I said I thought, I wasn't going to live to see this major global warming, because it kept saying 2030, 2040. I said I'll be gone, but no, I'm still here, and now it's global warming, and I'm sorry. I don't know if I'm glad to still be alive or not, because God knows what's in store for us now. I thought I was gone when this all happened.
The pavement in Las Vegas today is 160 degrees. So if you want to cook your dinner, just take a frying pan out on the street and put it down there. Thank you, Dorothy. Howie Hawkins, did you want to comment?
Yeah, I think as progressives, our duty is to be in solidarity with the oppressed. And when you come to Ukraine, the only imperialist army that invaded Ukraine with hundreds of thousands of troops used cluster munitions on civilians, depleted uranium shells on tanks, and has mined an area the size of the nation of Austria, is Russia. When we provided arms to the Red Army, did that make the USSR a proxy of the United States? I really think that's insulting to the people of Ukraine who are fighting for their lives. And we can see that. It's a people's war. It's not just the people in the armed forces. It's the whole society is mobilized to provide mutual aid and humanitarian aid to the third of the country that's been displaced from their homes, and, have had to become refugees or internally displaced people. Now, every war of national liberation like Ukraine's, all the imperialist powers try to influence it. That just, is the nature of world imperialism. But, what people like Dennis and his group, Sociální ruch, the social movement, say is, we're fighting both Russian tanks and Western banks. I mean, they get it. They know that Western imperialism is not on the side of the working class and the popular classes in Ukraine. I'm going to put two articles in the chat. One of them's by Dennis, and another one, they're both by this left group from Sociální ruch, about the question of negotiations. And, I think when we come to regarding what the Ukrainians want, we need to listen to them. They're fighting for their survival.
Okay, thank you for that. As I say, our main focus is on the petition for the Zaporizhzhia, but I've gotten it from both sides. In fact, I had a publication I used to write for that has ceased taking my articles because I had someone on our Zoom call that he didn't agree with on Ukraine. So it's a very hot button item. We have 94 people with us. We're at the top of the hour. MEDEA, Dennis, I will understand if you need to go. You've been with us a full hour, but we are going to continue. Josh Fox will join us, and later on, we will talk about his project. MEDEA, you wave your hand. So, do you want to give us a final word before you go?
Yes, well, thank you so much for this opportunity. Unlike what Howie says, I think our job as progressives is to end war, not fuel war. Our job is to find other ways of dealing with each other, to do everything we can to promote diplomacy and peace talks, to do everything we can to stop the militarization of our world. And I hope people, when they think about this issue, just have a little refrain in the back of your head that keeps saying, war is not the answer, war is not the answer, because it is not the answer. So thank you again for the opportunity. Let's work together to find a way to end this war, to stop a war with China, stop the war in Sudan. Let's just stop war and deal with the climate crisis. Thank you.
Yes, and clearly, whoever's right or wrong, if it continues, we'll all be dead. So thank you for that, MEDEA. Thank you for your lifetime of activism. I hope you come back and join us for the next big issue that comes up. But keep
Great,
up.
thanks so much. Great. Bye.
Thank you.